Here's something you've probably heard a lot of in the last few months. Russia is running out of tanks. But while this refrain was once something of a joke, now more than half a year into the invasion of Ukraine, it looks like a new reality, and you won't believe how bad it's gotten. As of August 2023, the numbers are truly staggering. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia has lost an estimated 4,330 tanks and 8,400 armored combat vehicles, not to mention over 250,000 soldiers. While these numbers are likely inflated to some degree, anything even close to these figures represents most of the country's pre-war supply of armor and will have long-lasting implications for both Russia and the international community. Similarly, a recent open-source investigation by Norwegian researcher Ragnar Gudmundsson shows that Russia is definitely relying on more and more older tanks. He found that in the first days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 71% of the lost tanks accounted for vehicles modernized or produced in the Russian Federation, and just 29% were Soviet-era models. However, as of June 2023, it was a very different situation. 73% of lost Russian tanks originated from the Soviet Union, while only 27% were newer types. This strongly suggests that Russian tank supplies have reached a tipping point, where they can no longer be replaced. It could also change the dynamics of this grinding conflict, potentially signaling that the Russian war effort is finally running out of steam. So let's dive into how this happened and just what it means for the future of the war in Ukraine. But first, let's take a second to talk about the invisible war every one of us is waging every day. Just like on the battlefield, in this digital era, where every move is traceable, you might feel cornered. But today's video sponsor, Surfshark VPN, offers a way out. Surfshark VPN is more than a privacy tool. It's your passport to the global internet. By encrypting all the data that's transmitted between your device and the web, it ensures your sensitive information remains inaccessible to snooping entities, be it tech giants or cybercriminals. Plus, with Surfshark, you can change your device's location, virtually traveling worldwide. With more than 3,200 servers across 100 countries, Surfshark lets you unblock streaming services like Netflix. Vacationing abroad? Simply relocate virtually to your home country. And for those in restricted zones, Surfshark breaks down digital walls completely, granting you unrestricted internet freedom. The web can be a dangerous place, especially on public Wi-Fi, but Surfshark acts as your online bodyguard. It encrypts data, obscures your IP, and with the Clean Web feature, you can evade ads, malware, and pesky trackers. Most importantly, Surfshark respects your privacy by not storing any activity logs. And for an added layer of protection, check out their supplementary tools like Alert, Antivirus, and Search. And Surfshark has a special deal for our viewers. Use code MilitaryShow and get an additional 3 months for free. Don't worry, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, giving you ample time to test the waters. The link's waiting for you in the description below, so why wait? Take control of your online journey with Surfshark VPN today. Alright, let's circle back to Putin's ongoing battle to hang on to his tanks. And honestly, by now, there's no surprises here. This guy's lack of skill is starting to feel like an endless saga. Reports over the summer have confirmed that Russian tank losses are so heavy that the country has moved many of its ancient Soviet tanks out of storage. This includes the T-54 and T-55, which are more than 75 years old and essentially obsolete in today's combat environments. Back when it made its battlefield debut, the T-55 was a highly effective tank, but it entered service just after the Second World War, soon becoming one of the most highly produced tanks ever, with an estimated 100,000 built over the next few decades. As a result, the T-55 played a role in just about every single conflict during the Cold War period, and frightened Western countries so much that they rushed to mass-produce their own battle tanks. It was also built to survive just about anything, with a massive 205mm of frontal turret armor and 120mm of slanted hull armor. This armor is so tough that the tank itself survived tests with a 15-kiloton nuclear explosion at only 300 meters away. The T-55 also has a 100mm gun, which was once a threat to anything in the NATO arsenal. But that was the 1950s. Today's modern tank systems make the T-55 look like junk, and there is little question which would prevail in a head-to-head battle. That's not to mention that T-55s also included a so-called jack-in-the-box flaw, which has doomed many of Russia's other Soviet-era tanks. Unlike modern battle tanks such as the German Leopard 2 or US M1 Abrams, which keep their shells away from the crew behind thick armored walls, older Soviet tanks store their ammunition in a carousel-style automatic loader sitting directly below the main turret and crew. A well-placed shot to their thin roof armor can ignite the ammunition and easily blow up the tank. As Professor Robert E. Hamilton of the US Army War College put it bluntly, for a Russian crew, if the ammo storage compartment is hit, everyone is dead. He adds that the force of the explosion will instantaneously vaporize anyone unlucky enough to be inside. So why has Russia been forced to rely on these death trap antiques, and what in the world happened to all its decent tanks? The short answer is that Ukraine happened. The long answer is that years of poor combat doctrine and failure to learn from past mistakes have made Ukraine's stunning success much easier than anyone predicted. Russia's initial offensive into the country last year was nothing short of a disaster, with endless strategic and tactical blunders, and ineffective approaches to modern urban and semi-urban combat. This was reflected strongly in the performance of its tank units. Battle tanks are one of the most effective and critical weapons in modern warfare. While jets and bombers are more destructive, they cannot be used to hold and control territory in the same way that a tank can. The main gun of a tank can pin down enemies and even level buildings. Some tanks have specialized rounds intended to do just that. Composite tank armor is also incredibly tough, using layers and structural reinforcement to stop anything short of another tank blast or very well-placed missile. And anything a tank is able to blow apart, it can also roll over, making most low cover ineffective. But for all their power, tanks can easily be stopped without proper support. Russia has continually failed to learn this lesson, which helps account for the abysmal performance of its tanks in Ukraine. And by taking advantage of this reality, Ukrainian defenders were able to pull off some of their most astonishing victories of the war. But while this has become obvious to most observers since February 2022, Russia's failure to properly utilize its tanks actually has quite an embarrassing history. For instance, during the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996, Russia mobilized its enormous arsenal of Soviet tanks to try and crush the smaller and less equipped Chechen forces. But as Russian troops discovered all the way back then, superior numbers and equipment don't mean very much when executed badly. Lacking their own tanks, Chechen rebels instead relied on anti-tank missiles, RPGs, tank mines, and even improvised explosive devices. Much as Ukraine has, they also use this limited toolkit to take advantage of major weaknesses in Russian warfighting doctrine. This doctrine relies on tanks leading the way of every ground assault, with infantry fighting vehicles behind providing close support. But the usefulness of infantry support is greatly diminished when troops are stuck inside vehicles, leaving them unable to detect ambushes or respond quickly. In Chechnya, rebels took advantage of this by fighting in urban environments and using guerrilla tactics to fire from many positions at once. Firing from above also allows them to target the thin armor on the tank's roofs, often resulting in devastating ambushes. Russia's enormous casualties from a tank-heavy warfighting doctrine with no effective infantry support would be repeated during the Second Chechen War only years later. Russia was able to secure eventual victory in both these conflicts by using brutal artillery strikes and the huge size of its armed forces to seize and hold the capital Grozny. But the wars showed some fundamental weaknesses which many people failed to pay attention to. As Olga Oleka, an analyst from the RAND Corporation, wrote way back in 2001 that failure to prepare for urban combat was a key error the Russians made in both Chechnya wars, but it was far from the only one. Hampered by poor training and supplies, decrepit equipment, and abysmal planning, the 1994–96 war presented a stark picture of how much this once great force had deteriorated. It also demonstrated how poorly the Russian military organizational structures functioned when disparate forces were called upon to work together. Sound familiar? It should, because today not a single one of these underlying issues had been addressed. Throughout the early 21st century, Russian combat doctrine continually relied on heavy tanks without adequate infantry support, counting on the use of superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm smaller enemies. Issues with training, supplies, equipment, and planning were never addressed, while Putin's kleptocratic dictatorship funneled huge chunks of the military budget into oligarchs' bank accounts. Fast forward to 2022, and it's pretty easy to see how the invasion of Ukraine was a disaster waiting to happen. Ukraine is far bigger than Chechnya, while its military is just as fiercely determined and tactically flexible as the rebels were. Ukrainian war planners also took advantage of the same weaknesses, drawing Russian forces into built-up urban areas where their tanks were highly vulnerable and unleashing extremely effective ambushes. This was obvious during the first weeks of the invasion, where Russian tank columns rolling into Kyiv were stopped in their tracks by Ukrainian ambushes. As armor and troops poured into the country, General Colonel Oleksandr Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's ground forces, determined that the Russian columns would need to advance along 2 or 3 major highways to enter Kyiv in their blitzkrieg attack. So Syrsky organized 2 rings of troops to defend the city, one in the outer suburbs and one in the capital, with as much space between them as possible, in order to minimize damage to infrastructure. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv, allowing them to easily target the highways and saving them from Russian airstrikes. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv. This strategy proved to be extremely effective, allowing defenders to destroy many of the slow-moving tanks. Videos like this now famous 45-second clip released by Ukraine's defense ministry showed entire companies of Russian armor being destroyed in deadly ambushes by Ukrainian hit-and-run teams using anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs. As Russian columns rolled through built-up urban areas in long, strung out with no infantry support, they were devastated by such barrages. This was even clearer later on. For instance, during the battle for the small town of Volodar. In early 2023, Ukraine placed hundreds of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in the fields outside the town. Due to the flat landscape and lack of cover, any Russian minesweepers were immediately targeted with artillery fire. Ukrainian troops left corridors between the mined fields, only large enough for 2 or 3 Russian tanks at a time to roll through. If the tanks moved at all from the cleared path, they risked having their treads blown off, leaving them totally exposed to artillery strikes. When Russian commanders predictably ordered their tanks to lead the assault along these unmined paths outside Volodar, it left them incredibly vulnerable to the same type of ambushes Ukrainians have deployed since the start of the invasion. Hiding in covered positions near the tank columns, Ukrainian hunter-killer teams set up anti-tank missiles on both sides of the kill zone. Without triggering the anti-tank mines, these teams were able to cross the minefields and dig themselves into strategic positions, often hiding in bushes or abandoned buildings. From there they could fire and retreat with little fear of being hit by tank fire. Much like Chechen rebels, Ukrainians also used building rooftops and windows to target the weakly armored top sections of tanks. Because Russia refused to dismount their infantry to avoid them getting shot, this left them completely unable to fight back. But unlike Chechen rebels, Ukrainian troops have also had the advantage of modern ATGMs, which they have used to incredible effect against Russian armor. These include everything from the more basic Ukrainian-manufactured Stugna P to advanced Western-produced systems like the Javelin, Next-Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon or NLAW, and AT-4. These 4 ATGMs have accounted for the majority of Russia's tank losses during the invasion, providing Ukrainians with a highly cost-effective way of handling tank columns. As a result, in just one 3-week period, Russia lost over 130 tanks and armored vehicles in Volodar, forcing Putin to rely on human wave-style infantry assaults to try and take the position. And in other battles during the war, Russia did actually dismount its infantry troops, but poor training and equipment meant that they failed to properly scan the flanks. When the ambushes began, many Russian soldiers also panicked, leading to a breakdown in the chain of command and chaotic, disorganized retreats. Infantry fled and tried to find cover wherever possible. In some places, Russian soldiers were even rolled over by their own armor. Footage from a later battle at Volodar, shared on Telegram earlier this year, showed 2 Russian soldiers being dragged under a retreating tank, and a soldier covered in flames running from a tank shortly before it exploded. Complete disasters like this are only possible with badly trained troops, as one of the earliest lessons taught in any effective infantry academy is how to react to ambushes by rallying and pushing out of the kill zone. Because Russian infantry have failed to do so, it often hasn't even mattered that they have dismounted to support the tank units. Multiply this by a year and a half of fighting, and it's easy to see why Russia is pulling antiques like the T-55 out of storage and museums, Recent satellite imagery shows that an open-air depot in remote Buryatia in eastern Siberia has lost about 40% of all tanks and armored vehicles it had previously been housing. This is Russia's largest known tank depot, suggesting that others may be even more depleted. And with every passing month, the Russian military fields increasingly less capable tanks as they cannot replace their losses. International sanctions mean they cannot obtain the advanced parts necessary to build more modern armor, such as the T-90 or T-14 Armata. It's also unclear how many tanks Russia was able to produce even before the invasion. Some Russian sources say that one of its largest tank production plants was capable of pumping out 20 a month, with others claiming slightly less. The country also has 2 new plants under construction, but even so, its production cannot compare to the staggering losses of more than 150 a month in Ukraine. And anything actually coming off the line in Russia is now certainly not modern. Sanctions mean no modern electronics for targeting or specialized kits like thermal vision. They even affect things as basic as ball bearings, which are crucial to the production of modern vehicles. Before the war, Russia received some 55% of ball bearings from Europe, Canada, and the US. These deficiencies make producing anything more advanced than a T-80 essentially impossible, seriously diminishing the future potential of Russian armor as a whole. Unable to obtain modern parts, Russia has resorted to pushing tanks off the line with only gunners' sights, reducing the range of their guns by almost 1.5 miles. That type of distance seriously matters against something like a Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams. Russian tanks will essentially have to engage in close-quarters combat, hoping that they can gain the element of surprise against superior Ukrainian firepower. Needless to say, this will result in even greater losses of armor and soldiers, creating a vicious cycle of decreased production and increased costs. Very few governments could sustain wartime production in such an environment, and Putin's government, as the last few years have shown us, is anything but effective or competent. This is especially true due to the economic strain and enormous costs imposed by the destruction of tanks and other materiel. During the first months of 2023, Russia blew through its entire defense budget for the year, and there are no indications that new sources of revenue are opening up. European price caps on Russian oil, import bans, and corruption and inefficiency in Russia's massive oil sector mean that this year it will be lucky to break even. This is a disaster for the country's wider economy, since the Russian oil and natural gas sector has historically been its most economically powerful, accounting for 20% of its pre-war GDP and 45% of its monthly budget. Adding to the economic pain is the fact that Russia is now taxing its domestic oil industry based on Brent crude prices, rather than its own energy prices, meaning energy companies in Russia are paying taxes on revenue that cannot even be generated. In the best case, this scenario will leave the country's oil market breaking even, meaning its funds cannot be used to subsidize the production of new tanks or any other military hardware. Long story short, there really is no effective path for Russia to keep its production of tanks going long-term, all while its embarrassingly bad combat doctrine and lack of modern technology ensures that steep losses on the battlefield will continue. While Ukraine has far less capability to produce its own tanks, that won't matter nearly as much if it continues to receive aid from the West. NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg recently confirmed that more than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered, and that means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition. In total, we have trained and equipped more than 9 new Ukrainian armored brigades. This will put Ukraine in a strong position to continue to retake occupied territory. Whether these are followed up by more tanks and armored infantry vehicles later this year or in 2024 likely depends on Ukraine's performance in its slowly ramping up counteroffensive, as well as continued international political support for Ukraine. There is little question that even the current supply of tanks will pose a massive challenge to Russia's ability to hold on to its occupied territory. But it is also a matter of more than just firepower. The UK Ministry of Defence recently wrote that Russia has constructed some of the most extensive systems of military defensive networks seen anywhere in the world for many decades, not just near the current front lines, but also deep inside areas Russia currently controls. Intelligence reports and satellite imagery show a particular effort to fortify the northern border of Crimea with a multi-layered defensive zone built up around the village of Medvedevka, including minefields designed to force Ukraine into a choke point. All of this indicates that Russian field commanders are at least now aware that their own losses are a serious issue, and that Ukraine's modern tanks will likely win in any head-to-head engagement. Because of this, the coming months of the war may become a standoff, with Ukraine unable to penetrate Russia's defensive positions, but Russia unable to launch another tank offensive for fear of losing its now limited supplies. In the end, as with many wars, the future of this conflict will most likely be determined by attrition. Whichever side can outlast the other will be able to gain the upper hand, especially in the critical area of tank warfare. Russia's experience so far shows that it never dealt with the long-standing issues present in its military and economy, something which has only been accelerated after a year and a half of war and sanctions. Its enormous tank losses certainly seem unsustainable, but only time will tell if they ultimately tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. But what do you think? Will Russian tank losses prove to be a deciding factor in the conflict, or will Russia be able to overcome its issues and keep Ukraine's counteroffensive from achieving success? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.